Okay, we will get started now. So, my name is Italy Fernandez. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the sales manager at Tobii Dynavox, and I work with our countries in East and Central Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And we are really glad to bring us very special guest from South Africa to you today to talk about this very important topic on self-advocacy and abuse prevention in AAC. And now on to our very special guest. I will give the microphone over to her very soon, but we are so delighted to welcome Dr. Juan Bornman from Stellenbosch University in South Africa. She is a professor at Stellenbosch and also avid AAC advocate. She's been practicing AAC since the 1980s, and she has a special emphasis on human rights. So today she's going to talk to us about a very important topic, and I will give the microphone now over to Dr. Bornman.
Thank you very much, Italy, for that warm welcome and introduction. I am going to now just quickly share my screen. If that is okay. Okay. And there we go. I hope that everybody can see the screen now. Good. Right, so welcome everybody, and thank you very much to Tobii Dynavox for this afternoon and giving me this opportunity to speak to a topic that I think is something that we all should take cognizance of and something that we really need to pay attention to. In this presentation this afternoon, I'd like to briefly discuss some of the barriers faced by crime victims with communication disabilities, and then also talk about the strategies that we can use to support them in becoming self-advocates. Then I'd like to speak about the role of communication in preventing abuse and ensuring access to justice. And then finally, I'd like to highlight some AAC strategies and techniques that we can use. And then I'm going to end off by showing a specific case study that we implemented in South Africa, and that is how we are actually creating some case law for the use of AAC in the criminal justice system. I know that the slides have quite a bit of text on them, and that is intentional because I do know that we all speak different languages, and it's a little bit easier sometimes if one is able to read on the screen while I'm talking, and not everybody might understand my specific accent. So I hope that is okay for everyone. Right, so first of all, let's look at what does abuse mean. And in this presentation for this afternoon, I'm going to be using the definition proposed by the World Health Organization already in 2017, and they speak about all of these different types of abuse, that we need to consider physical abuse. And there you can see the examples, things like punching, beating, kicking, biting, burning, certain forms of neglect, and that could be neglect related to nutrition, to shelter, to clothing, to hygiene, medical neglect, or even just abandoning somebody or leaving them unattended in a situation where we know that they are actually in need of support. Then we can also think about sexual abuse. And there we'll discuss it all the way from grooming, and that is preparing somebody, to rape. We'll be talking about exploitation and how that works, very often specifically related to making pornographic material, prostitution, for example. And then in the last instance, to also speak about emotional abuse. And that is when we know that a person has a need for some form of affection, and we deliberately withhold that affection, or when there is domestic violence in front of children, or even permitting a person to use substances, either drugs or alcohol, by the trusted people in the person's environment. So really focusing on all of these different types this afternoon. Now, why do we need to speak about this problem? And unfortunately, the scope of the problem is quite intense, and that is exactly why this is not a topic that we can have an idea like an ostrich and put our heads in the sand and hope that if we don't speak about it, that it'll pass, because it is a significant challenge. We know that with adults with disability, and here all forms of disability are included: sensory disability, intellectual disability, physical disability, multiple disabilities, that these adults are 4 to 10 times more likely to be a victim of abuse than their peers without disability. And we see that for children with a disability, it's approximately 3 to 5 times more likely. And these numbers actually come from large meta-analyses that have been done. And you will see there with the adults, the latest one has actually been done in 2024. So it's relatively recent statistics. We also know that the pattern for both children and adults is very similar, in that the abuse usually starts quite early in their life, and that it typically continues throughout their lifespan unless something happens and we intervene. This means that these individuals are repeat victims, and we know that when abuse is repeated, the intensity of the abuse increases. So the severity of the abuse increases, and then also the time period for this abuse. So it tends to be of longer duration. In persons with disability, it's also different to other forms of abuse, in that the perpetrators are usually known and familiar people. So we don't have something like strangers just suddenly abusing these individuals. Very often it's people in trusted situations like caregivers. Then the research also tells us that the victims are less likely to report that they've been a victim of abuse. And if they do a report, it's less likely to go to court. If it does go to court, the perpetrators usually receive a reduced sentence. And then also, these individuals are less likely to get counseling in cases of abuse. And this probably is related to the fact that a lot of the counseling strategies that are used rely on communication. So if a person has a communication disability, then of course this makes it quite challenging. Now, why do we see this increased risk of abuse? Why are these individuals so much more prone? And I think it's so important that we look at what the research is telling us and what the theories surrounding this is, because if we can understand the reasons for these abuse, that enables us to apply some of the prevention strategies. And in this routines activity theory that Cohen and Felsen developed, they weren't focusing on individuals with disability particularly, but I think that this really is applicable in these situations. They say that we have 3 different components that are needed in order for a crime to take place. And the first thing talks about a motivated offender. Then we have to think about the available victim. And then in the third instance, this lack of a capable guardian. So if we now unpack what this means, specifically when we look at individuals with communication disabilities, we see that the motivated offenders are typically those people who are in a trust relationship. And that might be somebody like the carer. And we can see that already there's this power imbalance between these two. And this offense might actually happen because of the stress experienced by the offender. So caring for an individual with a significant disability does evoke a lot of stress. It might also have some sort of provocative or frustrating antecedent. So something happened just before the abuse took place. And then research also tells us that the offenders might not fear the consequences because, as I said earlier, very often the sentencing is a lot reduced. Then we look at the victims and we see that persons with communication disabilities are often isolated. They might be at home, or if they were at school, they might be in a special class or in a special group. And all of these things make them easy targets because of the social isolation. And that leads to reduced protection because if there's not a lot of other people around you, you are just more available to a perpetrator. And then also the absence of a capable guardian, because we know that the guardians are often also the offenders. So the victimization of persons with communication disability is actually the product of an interplay between all three of these aspects. So we know that they are available victims because of the social isolation, and that is why, if we're thinking about education opportunities, why inclusion is so important, then we also have this offender who has easy access to the available victim, and then this lack of guardianship. Right. So then if we now think about how do we address all of this, this is such a multi-systemic, such a complex challenge. And that is why we need a multi-systemic approach in terms of looking at prevention. And here I would like to, in this talk this afternoon, very briefly look at all of these aspects. So the first important thing is, how do we really help persons with communication disability themselves in becoming self-advocates? How can we look at violence prevention programs, for example, at school? How do we train police officers, because the police is very often the entry level, the gateway in terms of the criminal justice system, and then to look at all of the role players in the criminal justice system. And that would be law students, because they are the legal practitioners of tomorrow. Then also looking at the prosecutors, looking at the judges and the magistrates, and how do we make sure that we target each one of these role players in a specific way. Now, if we look at self-advocates, what is a self-advocate? Who can be a self-advocate? And this is, of course, something that is really important for all of us, that we are able to speak out, but even more so for persons with disability because of the reasons related to social isolation that I've mentioned, related to reasons such as this prevailing attitude of, oh, we just need to feel sorry for these individuals, and this whole idea around charity related to disability, rather than looking at persons with disability as having their own rights and following a human rights perspective when we look at these individuals. So it is their human right to be their own self-advocates. And for us, it is important to know, how do we support these individuals to become self-advocates? So the goal is really to equip them with knowledge so that they can make informed and authentic decisions around some of the aspects that are related to their own lives. And by doing so, we can actually empower them to take control of these decisions. So self-advocates have the ability to speak up for themselves, irrespective of what mode of communication they use to speak up for themselves. They're able to ask for what they want. They're able to express their feelings and to develop a plan to achieve these goals, so that we can know, how do we support each one of these different components. So self-advocacy is also a form of self-determination and empowerment that can lead to increased confidence and a higher quality of life, because these individuals feel empowered to make their own decisions. So if we think about self-advocacy, there are three, I think, important aspects that we need to consider: aspects around knowing yourself, knowing what your needs are, but then also knowing how to get what you need. So that need for the aspects that can help you to fulfill these needs. And I think it's very important to highlight that all of this relates to individualization. And as I speak this afternoon and speak about what we need in terms of communication boards, for example, this need for individualization is something that we must always remember to come back to. There's no such thing as one size that fits all. It doesn't work for when you try and go and buy clothes, and it doesn't work for when you're trying to think about a communication system either. And then in terms of these needs, I think there are three important things that can happen. So knowing about what interventions you need. So they may be targeting a specific skill that a person would like to improve. Then also asking for the reasonable accommodations that they could have, things like the tools or the support strategies such as pictorial support. And then also knowing how can we modify certain tasks without changing the outcome of the task to make it easier for these individuals, like, for example, just allowing more frequent breaks in court. So in terms of becoming a self-advocate, I would like to share the journey of a young lady that we worked with. And this is actually also the story of how I became involved in working in this criminal justice system. So I was approached by a social worker who phoned, and she said she had this young lady who was almost 18 that would need to testify in court in a criminal matter, and she would need to testify relatively quickly. She was the oldest of four siblings. All four of the siblings had been abused. She had significant spastic quadriplegia. We didn't know anything more from her history. And we also did not know if the severity of the quadriplegia had increased over time because of the abuse. She had never ever been to school at all, so literacy was a huge challenge. The family did receive a care dependency grant for her. And this matter actually came to the attention of the authorities when two of her younger siblings entered school, because the teacher then really started expressing concerns about neglect and hygiene, about the health of her sister, and about the behavior of her brother. So when she came to me, the first thing that we had to do was to try and just do some fact finding. And that is, of course, what we typically do when we look at assessment. And I had to look, first of all, at some of the skills and the functions that she had, particularly related to her communication desire and both her receptive and expressive communication. With regards to communication desires, it soon became very clear that she really wanted to interact and wanted to communicate, and that she would use everything to her avail to make her needs known. We had to look at her motor skills. She had a lot of contractures, and she was had very difficulty in moving. We realized that she would not be able to use any real significant forms of sign to support her expressive communication. We looked at sensory skills, and both her hearing and her vision did not concern us at this time. We looked at her cognitive communication, and her cognition appeared to be on par. And this was an interesting thing, because when we tried to, of course, do one of the conventional tests for cognition, the fact that she had never been to school impacted and masked some of her skills on that test. So in regards to some skills, she knew a lot. But then in terms of things that you would typically be taught at school, like, for example, the name of shapes, she had difficulty with those. And then also to look at the socio-emotional aspects. Then we had to look at the extrinsic factors, and that would be all of the social roles that she performed, who her communication partners were, and what some of the environmental barriers were. Now, these extrinsic factors were really important to us, because when she was removed from the family, she was placed in a group home for children with disability, and she was by far the eldest in this group, and that made it quite complicated because she didn't really have a lot of other people that she could interact with. Her partners mostly tended to be everybody who was providing care to the younger children in this group home. So then we looked at her skills, and she was non-literate, but we thought that she had the potential for some literacy because after showing her the letters, the first letters of some of the people's names in her environment, she could recognize them, and she went back. She had some form of access with her right index finger. Although that was a very broad movement, she wasn't able to pinpoint specifically, so that impacted on the size of the cells that we could use. And then we had to look at her communication needs and the fact that it was within 2 months that we needed to get her to be able to communicate in court and narrate some of these events and be able to narrate them with a lot of specificity. So then we were very sure that we had to think of a system that she could learn very quickly in a relatively limited period of time. The support and the training, as I said, was quite complicated because there wasn't a lot of people available in the environment. And then one of the high school teachers, who was actually a math teacher, she said that she would give some of her time, and 3 afternoons a week, she went to visit this young lady and spend time with her, just talking to her, and thereby allowing her opportunities to practice using this communication system that we developed. We also know that the partners then had limited literacy skills in Afrikaans because they were mostly caregivers and had reduced literacy skills, and Afrikaans was not their first language, although it was this young lady's first language. The financial constraints, we couldn't afford a device that had voice output, for example. And then, of course, that her home language was Afrikaans, and that had implications at that point for speech synthesis. So when we started off with her system, and I'm sorry, I think you're not going to be able to see this properly with the photographs that are placed now over this, but you will see this on the slides afterwards. Is that we developed a core word list in an 8x7 grid for her. And then on the one side, we had all of these sort of core words that she needed. And then on a side, a lot of semantic categories that had a lot of other aspects that she could talk about, because this is very important that when you are preparing somebody, that you are not allowed to talk about the court case per se, and that we had to use other examples of things for her to talk about. And then a wonderful thing happened, and that was that a secondhand laptop was donated to her, and we could load the initial trial version of the grid. It was also that she then had the ability to start practicing typing. And because of the system that had voice output, she used that as a way of self-teaching her. Or of teaching herself. So she would type in something and then listen to the sound and listen if it sounded correct to her. So that was really very motivating. And every time when I went to see her, that she had literally typed pages and pages of output in terms of preparing herself. And the staff then also really liked that because they understood the voice output. But then when she turned 18, she had to move to a home for adults with disabilities. We had less contact time because there was no mobile phones or internet allowed. And that was because of the group home that feared recognition, because at that time the perpetrators hadn't been sentenced. Now we also didn't have this access to this high school teacher anymore that acted as a communication partner, but her circle of friends increased because there were so many more people in this adult home where she was now that could assist. Now, this was one of the biggest challenges that we had in terms of how long the court case dragged out. In the end, it dragged out for approximately 7 years. And then in this case, We had actually hoped that she would be able to testify using her AAC system, but that did not happen because the one perpetrator, who was a mother, actually pleaded guilty, and therefore she did not have the opportunity um, to testify. And then a few years later, her father also testified, and the court then said that she could provide what they call a victim impact statement. And a victim impact statement is where the victim is allowed to talk about what the effect of the abuse had been on them, and that was then allowed in terms of sentencing. So she felt that she still had some form of control because her voice was heard in court through this impact statement. And here you will see just some of the newspaper articles that followed. And this was that the mother actually then received 12 life sentences because of this case and everything that had happened to the children. And then in 2023, the father was sentenced, and he was then actually sentenced for 75 years in jail. Right. So when we look at the victim's viewpoint, then in terms of what is happening here, we know that there's a lot of also comorbid disabilities, things like intellectual disabilities. There might be physical disabilities, like in this case, sensory disabilities, and all of this impact on how difficult or how easy it is to be able to testify. Education is a challenge in our country, and I know in many other countries. And because of that, the literacy skills are often reduced, and that impacts, of course, then on not being able to use a text-to-speech type of device. A lot of individuals use idiosyncratic words for private body parts, and this is not only for persons with communication disabilities. I think it's something that we all do, and but it makes it quite complicated when one has to go to court and testify. Then also the ability to engage in different activities and in your health and your safety is compromised if the perpetrator is also the person who is responsible for providing those activities to you. In some cases, individuals might not know that what had happened to them or what is currently happening to them is a crime, because they have to rely on others for a lot of private caregiving. There are sometimes feelings of shame, embarrassment, and the emotional toll of reporting an abuse case, that they feel as if they are somehow to blame for what had happened to them. Some individuals have said that the police have been disrespectful because of their disability. Some victims and family members feel that these individuals lack credibility when reporting a crime, as if they have to prove that they are being a trustworthy source. And then also fears of retribution, especially if the perpetrator is a family member, or in some cases, even the breadwinner of the family. So then what had happened is we developed these 4 communication boards that can be used to disclose abuse. Here we have boards that are related to children and boards that are related to adults. And both of these boards have like a front and a back. On the one side, we have symbols, and on the other side, we have the alphabet, so that it's just easier to communicate some of these things. These boards have been translated into a lot of different languages, so I would encourage everybody to maybe go onto the website of the Center for AAC in South Africa. These boards are all there for free download, and check if your specific language is not perhaps available there. And if your language is not available, please make contact with me and let's see how we can translate those languages. Some of the latest ones that have been included are Bulgarian, for example. Then also thinking about other forms of prevention strategies, and that would be things like how to say stop or no, information about touch, what is a safe touch and an unsafe touch. Remember, as I said earlier, particularly in cases where a person has to rely on others for intimate and physical care, this is becoming a huge concern. Knowing what body parts are the private body parts and the public body parts. So usually is in many cases, we will know that we talk to children about if you put on your bathing costume, everything that your bathing costume covers, that is private. Those are the things that we have to protect. Then thinking about secrets, good and bad secrets, and good secrets always have expiry dates. Things like a gift for mommy or for daddy. In South Africa, we celebrated Father's Day on this past Sunday. And then it's quite difficult to get the little ones to keep quiet about what we got daddy for Father's Day. But knowing that a good secret is always something that at some point there will be an expiry date. At some point, everybody will know what the secret was. Thinking about positive and safe relationships. So when is a relationship something different? And this not only goes for in-person relationships, but also for cyber relationships. Thinking about risky situations. We know that there are specific situations, like, for example, children that use transport to go home after school. The transport situation might be risky. The bathroom situations are risky. So thinking about all of these and drawing attention to them, thinking about the rules with adults. And as I said in the beginning, not only strangers, the stranger danger is not always a huge challenge with individuals with communication disabilities. And then also thinking about rules for online safety. And online safety and cyberbullying is, of course, becoming an increasingly bigger concern in our day and time. Then to also think about all of the signs of abuse in children with disability. We know that the signs of abuse in children with disability may or may not be the same as children without disability, because sometimes they might be more prone to having bruises on their bodies, for example, due to their physical disability. So the important thing is, again, as I said in the beginning, that we really think of this on an individual basis. So don't make certain assumptions by looking at these signs in isolation. We really need to look at them in combination. But there is a paper, a 2023 article by Amanda Neiberg, who actually did look at what some of these specific signs are, and you will see the reference on this slide if you are interested in finding out more. And then also to look at all of these violence prevention programs. And it really is best if we are able to provide these prevention, these be safe type of programs in a school situation, because we do know that that is where children are optimally susceptible for learning about their own safety. A lot of programs have been developed. The sad thing is that children with disability are very often the ones that are excluded from these violence prevention programs. So it is important that we think about how we can include these children. Now, there's a lot of different strategies that we can use to facilitate this, things like storytelling, role play videos, etc. Thinking about using worksheets, books, etc. and all of the different materials. And of course, this is where AAC is such a perfect strategy and a tool to assist us, because we can use pictorial supported communication in just making a lot of these really difficult constructs so much easier to understand. For example, things like consent. What does it mean? How can we demystify exactly what the components are to make sure that we get that? Then if we look at the police officers, because we know that they are sort of as I said in the beginning, the gatekeepers in terms of helping a person to access the criminal justice system. And here it is important that we did a big study looking at police officers and that they really have limited knowledge and training and skills in taking statements from people who have all forms of disability. And therefore, these cases do not make it through the criminal justice system. The police specifically said that communication was a big challenge for them, and understanding how that all relates to hearing disabilities and intellectual disabilities, and then stating that these things make them feel it, confronting a person with a disability makes them feel uncomfortable. And then very often that feeling of uncomfortableness is transferred onto the victim. And if you treat somebody in an uncomfortable manner, that person becomes more uncomfortable. So it really creates this vicious circle of everybody feeling totally at ill ease with each other. And then we said to the police, so what would be some of the things that you would need training on? And then they said they really needed some form of disability training, but they wanted this disability sensitivity training to really focus on communication skills. So knowing exactly what it is that they needed to do to help a person understand receptively, but also to facilitate expressive skills. They needed infographics about some of these legal definitions, like what is rape? How do you explain rape and consent? The need, a need for the vocabulary related to the body parts. And here specifically thinking about both the front and the back of the body, the particular environmental places where the abuse might have taken place, and then also thinking about how do we help a person understand the sequence of time. And here we have started working on thinking about important dates or important events in a person's life. Like, did it happen before your birthday or after your birthday, before Christmas or after Christmas? So trying to think about these bigger events and then how to navigate around that. So then we developed a police training workshop, and you will see that this training workshop had 4 different components. So the first one really just introduced human rights basically, and then spoke about the police code of conduct. And this was very important because it's important that we meet the police where they are and help them to see that this is not something different or something additional that they have to do, but this is something to help them look at their own code of conduct and how they can expand that. Then we did a broad introduction to disability and looking at some of the barriers and the facilitators to participation. Then we brought it more specifically down to communication, looking specifically at AAC and the role of communication partners, because we know that co-construction is something that is so important in AAC. And then looking specifically then at how do we then use AAC not only for interaction, but to also take a statement, and what could be some of the strategies that we use. Now, I think the other thing that you can't see there on the side of the slide is that all of these programs highlighted that we used an adult with a communication disability herself as a self-advocate to do a part of the training. And I think that really just opened the police's uh, uh, understanding of this complex topic in a way that we would never have been able to facilitate in a different way. And a lot of them afterwards actually said that that was the single factor that made the biggest impression on them. So I think that whenever one does any of these training workshops, you have to use self-advocates to help with the training. Then all of the activities, all 4 of these modules also started with a communication activity and a role play. And then when we ended, we always ended with some sort of discussion and again a case discussion, so that it made it very real and not only focusing on this theoretical perspective, because I think we know that disability sensitivity training programs have been around since the, I don't know, 1970s, and yet it hasn't made all of that bigger impact. And that is particularly, in my opinion, one of the reasons for that is the fact that it hasn't addressed the emotions attached to that as well. So it's trying to only work on the head knowledge and not so much on the heart knowledge as well. Then if we look at the legal practitioners, now this is also an interesting group of individuals within the criminal justice system. And here it has to do with all of the difficulties in providing access to the legal system. And that could be anything from the physical access, things like having ramps in the courtrooms, if we think about the space in court where a person has to testify, it's usually not large enough for a wheelchair to fit in there. Thinking about all of the rituals and procedures in court, the specific attire that is worn, all of that creates a certain expectation in court. All of the legal formalities, understanding what it means to take the oath, what it means to not tell a lie, and what the implications are of lying in court. Difficulties with accommodating testimonies and giving evidence in alternative formats because things have been set in such a specific routine way. In South Africa, for example, we still had the rule of only giving testimony viva voce, which means in a live voice. And that, of course, had implications for persons who needed to use AAC. And then also thinking about the questioning strategies and how we can adapt that in some way to modify the questioning strategies, but still having the same outcome in the end. And then also difficulties with interpreting nonverbal behavior. A lot of training has been done in court, not looking at persons with disabilities specifically, but looking at general behavior and then saying things like, if a person does not make eye contact, it might mean that the person is admitting guilt. It might be a sign of trying to hide that the person is guilty. Now, we know, of course, for individuals with autism who have challenges with eye contact, this could have detrimental effects if this is interpreted, this nonverbal behavior is interpreted to mean an admission of guilt. So if we think then about the legal practitioners, the lawyers, the prosecutors, the judges and magistrates, we have to look at a long-term perspective in terms of how we do that training. We have to do some training at the undergraduate level, so getting the new lawyers to understand exactly what it is that they are in for, but then also thinking about giving more in-depth knowledge at a postgraduate level, like at a PhD or master's level, and then also to include that as part of continuous professional development. So knowing about disability and understanding different forms of communication is not something that just requires a once-off training. It is something that we have to continuously come back to and unpack in a bit more detail. So when we looked at the legal practitioners and tried to support and train them, it really focused on a lot of the knowledge and the skills that they would need. And again, like with the police officers, so important to immediately contextualize the information for them, because we know that adults learn best if they can take the new knowledge and hook it on to their existing knowledge. So these legal practitioners did not want to feel as if they were being trained in things that were of no real use to them. So we try to always use problem-based learning and tie it down to specific case studies. Then we thought about the use of photographs and symbols, because initially they were saying, no, we can't use photographs and symbols. We have to only use text, and people need to be able to produce their own text, until we started explaining, but maybe it could be similar to a recognition parade. So for every one symbol that we have to have at least 7 foils that would be something related but different to the exact concept that we wanted. In the South African criminal justice system, it's usually 1 to 7 because it has to be a total of 8 different options from which to choose. Then thinking about how do we incorporate both core vocabulary as well as fringe vocabulary. And remember that's example. Oh, here's the example again of this communication folder that I showed you in the beginning, so that we would have the core vocabulary to always be available to the individual. And you can see that we just use the Fitzgerald key and we do the color coding just to make it easier to access and find some of the symbols. And then on the side to have some of the fringe vocabulary, because that would be the things that we can really custom design to the individual, and looking at the specific context and some of the specific words that were needed. For example, in the case study that I showed you right in the beginning, one of the factors that nobody was aware of was that this family, that they were actually also producing drugs. And through the testimony of this young lady who, with the AAC, when she started speaking to the social worker, she was able to suggest a lot of the vocabulary around this process, and that was then actually corroborated with some of the other findings later on. And then also to just look at all of the different forms of options that we can have to display. So we can use alphabet boards, and these alphabet boards can, of course, be in the format of like a QWERTY keyboard, as a lot of individuals would understand that. Then in the middle, we just have one that looks at the big categories of words and grouping them together. And this, of course, would be for an individual who is literate, but having some of the written out phrases or words just reduces the amount of keystrokes, and then, of course, makes it easier and quicker to communicate. Then there, with all of the different colors, we would see a eye gaze system. So for somebody who would, not eye gaze, auditory scanning, sorry, so that we would have that the person would say, okay, the pink, the green, the blue, the yellow, or the orange, and then within that to scan through the individual options. This is specifically a board that also works with Afrikaans-speaking individuals. And then on the side where you can't see is just also an example of a device layout. The categories, of course, in terms of vocabulary that is needed in court would be to answer these 5 questions: the who, the when, the what, the why, and the how. And here's just 2 examples of some of these boards, looking at the core words that we need, but also thinking about the different fringe vocabulary that is needed. And then, of course, the legal practitioners also need to have knowledge on the different forms of court accommodations that they can be asking for. And here would be a whole range of different court accommodations. And these accommodations are actually provided for in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, so the UNCRPD. And most of the countries have actually ratified this document. So this is something that is available to all of us, irrespective of our individual country contexts. So thinking about the environment in court, then thinking about physical accommodations, how to allow for remote testifying, how do we facilitate communication? For example, the use of intermediaries, avoiding leading questions, and adapting some of the other questioning strategies. And then also thinking about what happens just before going to court. So how do we prepare these individuals, but also what happens after court in terms of the sentencing. And then, as I said, I wanted to just end off by this case study that was recently trialed in South Africa in 2021. Ruby was a young girl. She was 14 years old when she testified in court, also had cerebral palsy, specifically spastic quadriplegia, and significant communication disabilities. And she was raped by a family friend when she was only 7 years old. She disclosed it to her mom at that time, and the perpetrator was arrested. But due to the lack of evidence and the fact that she wasn't able to then communicate and explain what had happened to her, the perpetrator was set free. She had also, like the first case, never attended school because there wasn't a school that was available for her. In South Africa, we don't have inclusive education. We have a special school system. So a school for children who have physical disabilities, a school for children with intellectual disabilities and sensory disabilities. And the problem, of course, with a child like Ruby that has a multiple disability is then very often she's too physically disabled for the school of children with physical disabilities, or the fact that she had multiple challenges also made it really challenging for her. Her grandmother then, shortly after this person was released, her grandmother became her legal guardian, and then she consulted a social worker. Now, this social worker was really an amazing woman who did not give up, and her tenacity in the end actually ensured that when Ruby was 11 years old, that this case was reopened. The social worker then also found the support from the National Prosecuting Authority and other role players. That's when I became involved, for example. And then we were able to also again teach her how to use a picture-based AAC system with the Afrikaans synthesis voice synthesizer, because since the previous case, this has now become available. And then on 28 August 2020, this rapist was found guilty and he was sentenced, unfortunately, only to 8 years in prison. But Ruby's testimony using this picture-based AAC system played a significant role in this conviction, and she was able to answer questions with a lot of specificity. And these questions were both when she was giving evidence in chief, so when she was giving her testimony, but also during cross-examination. And this was the first case in South Africa then where we were able to actually use her communication system in giving testimony, because as I said in the first case, she was only able to do a victim impact statement and not testify per se. So again, the media really reported on this and spoke about how important it was that there was this new way of testifying and that this was allowed. And subsequently, the court had actually decided to adjust that specific act. So viva voce is no longer a necessity if a person is not able to testify in a live voice. So in conclusion then, if we think about something like abuse and how to prevent abuse, we can see that it really is this multifaceted challenge, and therefore we need to have a multifaceted solution. So how important it is that we train different role players across the whole criminal justice system to support persons with communication disability. And here it is about accepting all forms of communication, that we speak directly to the child. And I said here child just to differentiate that it's the person with a communication disability and not to the caregiver or the support person. To be patient and provide access. For example, ask, how does this person communicate? And then also thinking about all of the vocabulary that we needed to think about. How do we allow the person to disclose abuse, but also to testify and also to give a statement, that we have to think about all of the different categories and word types, and that it really should be individualized to the specific person and the specific crime, because no one case really is applicable to all different crimes. And then I'd just like to also say thank you again to so many people who have worked with me, colleagues and co-workers and students. And I'm also saying thank you in advance to all of those people that I hope that will still collaborate with me going forward, because the last word on this has definitely not been said. And specifically here to say thank you to Toby Dynavox for giving me this opportunity to be able to share this information with you. There's also a big reference list. So if anybody is interested in looking at any of these references, they are available and you would have access to them. And then I think I'd just like to conclude, like Einstein said, that the biggest evil in this world is not that of the evil done by evil people, but by the good people who stand by and who do nothing. And thank you for joining this afternoon and not being just a passive bystander, but for looking out and making sure that we can all join hands in this fight against abuse of persons with communication disabilities. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan, for this incredible presentation and for bringing awareness to this really important topic. And we know that this is happening worldwide and that this impacts all of us and the work that we do every day and the people that we're interacting with. And this really is helpful. So I want to thank Dr. Juan Bornman, as well as everyone that has participated in this session, and then those who will watch it later as well. And I will now open with checking the chat for questions. So please don't be shy. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask, you can feel free as well. But I'm going to go in now and see if there are any questions for you. So I do know that my colleague sitting to the right of me is very excited to ask a question. So we can start with Lena.
Yeah, I actually do have one, and I would really like, first of all, to thank you, Juan, for a beautiful lecture. And I think a lot of people would benefit from it. And I would love to hear your experience on how can we discuss the presence and availability of explicit symbols in someone's AAC device, because I see the repeated discussion, usually among parents, sometimes their own carers, where they choose to limit vocabulary on the device. And very often it is their choice because, you know, they are the ones putting the information in the device. And I would love to find good arguments for such conversations.
Thank you, Lena. I think that is a very pertinent and a very important question. The first thing that I think is really important if we think about this whole discussion is that, of course, when we think about the age of the children, we don't immediately start off by giving a child access to the whole range of all of the different explicit symbols. It is something that, together with one's other vocabulary, that this also increases, and that we talk to parents and that we explain to them why we also need to give access to some of these symbols, and then to start off by just introducing a few symbols and making sure that this vocabulary also grows while the child's other vocabulary is growing. I am also one of the people that I don't necessarily always think that the more explicit symbols need to be right on the front page of the device, but it's important that we teach the child where those symbols are, that they can still access those symbols and be able to get to those symbols. It's very important that you are able to get to those symbols also independently, and that you don't need to rely on somebody else to have access to those symbols. We have also found that sometimes it's very important just for that initial phase of just disclosing that something has happened. There you don't always need access to all of the really explicit symbols, but that you can say things like using some of these generic words. And one of the words that a lot of children are using is something like stuff. Stuff has happened or whatever. And then if a child discloses something like that, then of course you can access and delve deeper and see if we can then unpack exactly what this stuff means that they want to talk about. Not sure if that helps.
Thank you. It does. I think it's a really good starting of this conversation. Thank you.
And we've also included in the chat a link to that Juan had shown us earlier with the 21 different languages of the communication boards on this topic, if you'd like to localize them. And we're also working together with Juan to create more symbols on this topic of abuse prevention so that people can advocate for themselves, can be taught that these symbols exist and how to talk about body parts and things that are happening to them so that they are able to participate in the conversation and help themselves. It's our role, I think, to teach them these symbols and give them the opportunities to be able to talk to that. Let's check the chat in case there are more questions. We have a lot of great comments here, very impactful. Thank you. Extremely interesting and thought-provoking. Really interesting and useful reminder to make sure we are always considering this. Very insightful and valuable. I just don't want to make sure I don't miss any questions. I will ask one in the meantime. What do you think is the role of professionals like educators, those supporting individuals using AAC? What do you think is their role in educating and in using these symbols?
Thanks, Italy. I think that's a very important question because we have to think about, as I said, the literature tells us that for typically developing children, educators are one of their main sources of information. And we know that children get access to understanding how sexuality works, how their bodies function and work in some way or another. And we can either give them the appropriate information by means of education, typically through the role of professionals, or else somebody else is going to just take up that role and somebody else will give that information, and then we have no control over what the quality or the correctness of that information is. And I think that is why it's so important that that all of the practitioners who work in this field, that they become aware of the dangers related to sexuality and abuse, and that we equip ourselves with the necessary knowledge, and then to just think about not seeing it as something so strange or so different and saying to children, now sit down and I'm going to tell you about something terrible that can happen, but to introduce it in the same way that we would do with all typically developing children, so that we can start normalizing a lot of the education and the learning that has to take place. Because by doing so, we are really creating self-advocates from as young a age as possible. I think self-advocacy is really the key into this field.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? Oh, we have another comment. Thanks so much, Juan. Great to know that input is being provided to all stakeholders in the criminal justice system.
Oh, thank you.
I do think that it is extremely important that we continue to develop the vocabulary for people to be able to speak up for themselves. And I would like to just let you all know that you should keep your eyes out for updated communication boards and updated symbols on this topic, because we feel that it's our role and very important to be able to provide as wide a vocabulary and as specific a vocabulary as possible so that we can help prevent any abuse in the future.
Absolutely. And thank you once again to Toby Dynavox for assisting in developing these symbols and for just disseminating them and making them available, because this is really not something that one person alone can try and tackle. And I'm so happy that, you know, you guys are on board and that we can just all join hands in this endeavor.
Thank you for bringing us in. We have another question. Do you think inclusive schools are helpful to prevent abuse? So the student is maybe the only person with a disability. A device is sometimes something weird for the others.
Yeah, inclusive education is a big topic that is something that we can spend the whole afternoon on. But I know that there are lots of different ways in which inclusion can happen, but I do think that children need to be included and have opportunities to socialize with other children, and have access to the typical curriculum in adapted format if that needs be, but to have access to those children. So yes, I do think that it is an important strategy, because we do know that social isolation is one of the contributing factors to abuse. And then, of course, children are curious about difference. So yes, the device might be something very different and weird for the other children, but then it's the educator's role to, I think, demystify all of that and use that as a wonderful teaching opportunity to teach the other children about the device. I hope that answered the question.
I think so. Anyone else? Last chance. All right. Thank you again, Dr. Juan Bornman. We so appreciate you sharing your knowledge and also talking about these really powerful cases to give life to abuse prevention. These are real people. This is happening everywhere in the world. And I think it's so important that everyone is aware and how to help stop it. So thanks again from Tobii Dynavox, from me personally, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.